The night Mabel found the man collapsed in the snow began the way all the worst nights of her life did, with a broken promise. She was 23 years old, blonde hair braided down her back, hands roughened from years of scrubbing stone and leather, and she owned exactly one decent dress. Lady Helga had sewn it for her 3 winters ago, linen the color of dry sand, with simple embroidery along the sleeves. Mabel kept it folded inside a rough wooden chest, waiting for the right moment to wear it. That night, she had decided, was that moment. The gathering of the packs happened once every 2 years in the stone hall of Hartville, where the leaders of the 5 northern packs came together to renew alliances, settle disputes, and, among other things, recognize bonds. Mabel was no leader of anything. She was a maid in the household of Beta Rodden, of the Grey Pack, and she had only been invited because Rodden himself had told her, on an autumn afternoon, wine warming his voice softer than usual. "You'll come with me to the gathering, Mabel. I'll present you before the pack. Everyone will know who you are to me." She had believed him. She had spent 2 weeks turning those words over in her mind. She had pictured the hall, the torches, the pack banners hanging from the stone columns. She had pictured Rodden beside her, his hand over hers, and the feeling, that rare, fragile feeling, of truly belonging somewhere for the first time in her life. That was why she had taken the dress out of the chest. That was why she had braided her hair with care, worked cedar oil through the strands, and put on the only jewelry she owned, 2 small copper rings her mother had left her before she died. When she arrived at the stone hall of Hartville, the feast was already in full motion. The scent of burning resin mixed with red wine and wolf leather, and the smoke from the torches curled lazily up toward the darkened timber ceiling. Long tables filled the center of the hall, loaded with roasted meat, rough bread, clay pitchers, and pewter cups. Around them, men and women of the packs moved with the ease of people who had been born knowing they belonged there. Mabel stood at the entrance for a moment, holding her gray cloak against her chest, taking everything in quietly. Then she handed the cloak to the door guard and stepped inside. Rodden was near the fireplace. She saw him before he saw her, and for one foolish instant she felt that hope rise in her chest like an ember catching. He wore his formal dark blue tunic, brown hair combed back, and he was speaking to a woman Mabel didn't recognize. Tall, silver-embroidered dress, the posture of someone who had never carried a bucket in her life. Then Rodden looked at Mabel, and in that single second, she saw everything she needed to know. There was no warmth in his expression. There was only a mild discomfort, the look of a man who has just remembered an obligation he had hoped to avoid. He stepped slightly away from the woman in the silver dress, moved 2 paces toward Mabel, and said in a low voice, barely moving his lips, "You shouldn't have come in that dress." Mabel felt heat rise to her face. "You said you would present me," she answered, equally quiet. "Things have changed." Rodden glanced sideways. The Vorn family arrived last night. The patriarch brought his youngest daughter. There are negotiations underway. Negotiations. An alliance between the Grey Pack and the Vorn Pack. He finally looked at her directly, but his eyes carried no apology, only the blunt efficiency of someone closing a door. "It's a political matter, Mabel. You understand how these things work." She understood perfectly. She understood that she had ironed the sand-colored dress twice before putting it on. She understood that the copper earrings her mother had left her were the most precious things she owned, and she had worn them tonight for him. She understood that she had walked 2 hours through cold mud to reach this hall because a man had made her a promise with wine on his breath and no intention of keeping it. "Yes," she said, "I understand how these things work." She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that crying in front of people who were already looking past you only gave them one more thing to dismiss. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin a fraction, and turned toward the door. The hall was loud around her. No one had noticed. That was the particular cruelty of being invisible. The humiliation happened in full view of everyone, and still no one saw it. She was 3 steps from the door when she heard the voice. "Leaving already?" It came from the left, unhurried, almost amused. She turned. There were 3 men she had not seen come in. They stood near the far stone pillar, slightly apart from the rest of the crowd, and the space around them felt different, heavier, more deliberate, the way the air feels before a storm makes itself known. The other guests hadn't approached them. Even the most senior betas in the room had angled their bodies slightly away, the unconscious deference of wolves who recognize a higher rank without needing to be told. The one who had spoken was leaning against the pillar with one shoulder, arms loosely crossed, a faint smile on his face. He had dark red hair, sharp green eyes, and the relaxed posture of someone who found most situations entertaining. He was watching Mabel with open curiosity, as though she were the only interesting thing that had happened to him all evening. Beside him stood a broader man, darker, with a thick jaw, and a scar running from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone. He wasn't smiling. He was simply observing, with the calm patience of someone who has learned to read rooms before entering them. And the third one was not leaning against anything. He stood straight, not stiffly, but with the settled stillness of someone who has never needed to fill a room with movement or noise to make his presence felt. He was tall, black braids falling past his shoulders, leather armor crossed with dark buckled straps, a fur-edged mantle across his back. There was a faint scar along his jaw, barely visible in the torchlight. His eyes were pale, not quite gray, not quite blue, and they were fixed on Mabel with an attention so direct and so quiet that it felt, absurdly, like being seen for the first time. He had not spoken. He didn't need to. "I said what I came to say," Mabel replied, keeping her voice even as she looked at the red-haired one who had spoken. "The evening is over for me. That's a shame." The red-haired man pushed off the pillar, tilting his head slightly. "You had the most interesting entrance of anyone here tonight, and now you're going to walk out before it gets good." "Calder," said the scarred man beside him, with the flat tone of someone who has issued this particular warning many times before. "I'm being sincere, Bram," Calder said, completely unbothered. Mabel glanced between them. Then, almost against her will, her eyes moved back to the third man. The still one. The silent one. He hadn't moved. He was still watching her with that quiet, precise attention, and something about it made her feel strangely steadied, as though his calm was the only still point in the entire noisy hall. "Who are you?" she asked him directly. A beat of silence. Somewhere behind her, she heard Rodden laugh at something the Vorn girl had said. The man with the black braids and the pale eyes looked at her for one more moment, as though weighing something. Then the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close. "Someone who noticed," he said, "that you walked in here with more dignity than anyone in this room, and you're about to walk out with even more." Mabel blinked. It was not the answer she had expected. It was not flattery, not teasing, not the practiced charm of a man trying to keep a woman's attention. It was simply an observation, spoken quietly and without performance, as though he were stating a plain fact about the weather. She did not know his name yet. She did not know that the 5 pack leaders in the room had gone slightly rigid the moment he walked in. She did not know that the banners on the far wall, the black banner with the silver wolf, the crest of the high throne, belonged to him. She did not know that the man standing 3 feet away from her, looking at her like she was the only thing worth looking at, was Darius Vane, the Alpha King. She only knew that for the first time that night, something inside her chest had stopped hurting quite so sharply. And that, for now, was enough to make her stay. She did not stay because of him. That was what Mabel told herself, at least, as she turned away from the door and moved instead toward the far end of the hall, where a narrow wooden bench ran along the stone wall beneath a row of unlit sconces. She sat down, straightened the sand-colored dress over her knees, and folded her hands in her lap with the particular composure of someone who has had a great deal of practice appearing calm while feeling the opposite. She stayed because leaving would have meant walking 2 hours back through cold mud in the dark, and she had already done the hard part of arriving. That was the reason. It had nothing to do with pale eyes or quiet voices, or the strange grounding sensation of being observed by someone who actually seemed to mean it. Nothing at all. The hall continued its noise around her. Somewhere near the central tables, a musician had begun playing a low-string instrument. The melody threading through the conversation and laughter like smoke, finding the gaps in old stone. The torches burned amber and orange, throwing long shadows across the pack banners overhead. The gray wolf of the Grey Pack, the double pine of the Vorn family, the 3 rivers of the eastern clans. And at the far end, half in shadow, the black banner with the silver wolf that she had never seen before tonight. She was looking at that banner when someone sat down beside her. Not one of the 3 men from the pillar. This was a woman, small, dark-haired, with quick brown eyes and a shawl the color of heather wrapped around her shoulders. She dropped onto the bench with a familiarity that suggested she had been sitting on hard surfaces her entire life, and had stopped apologizing for it. "You're Mabel," the woman said. It was not a question. Mabel turned to look at her. "I am. And you?" "Petra." She said it the way people say names that have been unremarkable their whole lives and they've made peace with it. "I work in the Hartfell kitchens. I saw what happened with the Beta Rodden situation." Mabel felt the familiar tightening in her jaw. There was no situation. "He promised to present you, and then chose the Vorn girl instead, because her father controls 3 trade routes, and your father controlled nothing," Petra said, with the brisk compassion of someone who has no patience for pretending obvious things aren't obvious. "That's a situation. It's a rotten one, and you handled it better than most would have." Mabel was quiet for a moment. Then, because there was something disarming about complete bluntness from a stranger, "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Thank whatever made you keep your chin up instead of making a scene." Petra poured something from a small clay jug into a cup and handed it to Mabel without asking. "Drink. It's warm cider with something stronger in it. You look like you need both." Mabel took the cup. The warmth of it spread through her cold fingers immediately, and she was grateful for that small, simple thing in a way that felt disproportionate to its size. "The 3 men near the pillar," she said after a moment. "Do you know who they are?" Petra's hand stilled on the jug for just a fraction of a second. Then she set it down carefully and looked at Mabel with an expression that mixed surprise with something else, a kind of cautious interest. "You spoke to them?" "One of them spoke to me, the red-haired one." "That's Calder Vane," Petra said. "The Alpha King's youngest brother. The scarred one is Bram Vane, the middle brother. They're both alphas in their own right, but they answer to the oldest." She paused. "You know who the oldest is?" Mabel looked across the hall toward the stone pillar. The 3 men were no longer there. She scanned the room slowly and found them near the head table, where the 5 pack leaders had gathered in a cluster of lowered voices and careful postures. The still one, Darius, stood slightly apart from the group, as he seemed to do naturally, listening without appearing to listen, taking in the room without appearing to watch it. Even from across the hall, his presence had that quality, like a low sound felt more than heard. "Tell me," Mabel said. "That's Darius Vane," Petra said quietly. "Alpha King of the Northern Throne. He rules all 5 packs. Every alpha in this room, including your Beta Rodden, answers to him." She picked up her own cup. "He hasn't attended a gathering in 4 years. No one was expecting him tonight." Mabel absorbed this in silence. She thought about the way he had looked at her, the way he had said someone who noticed, as though it were simply the truth, and truth required no decoration. She thought about the way every other person in the room had angled away from him instinctively, the way water moves around stone, and how he had seemed entirely accustomed to that distance, not saddened by it, not hardened by it, simply familiar with it, the way a man grows familiar with the particular shape of his own solitude. "Why is he here?" she asked. "No one knows yet." Petra glanced toward the head table, but when the Alpha King travels with both his brothers, it isn't for a social call. At that moment, the cluster near the head table shifted, and Mabel saw Rawdon step slightly back, his posture changing in the subtle, instinctive way of a beta, deferring to an authority it cannot challenge. Beside him, the Vorn patriarch was speaking rapidly, his hands moving with the gestures of a man accustomed to commanding attention. Darius listened. He did not react. He simply listened, and somehow that stillness made every other man in the circle look slightly smaller. Then, without any visible reason Mabel could identify, Darius turned his head. Across the entire length of the hall, through the noise and the torchlight, and the crowd of wolves from 5 different packs, his pale gaze found her directly. She did not look away. She wasn't sure she could. For 3 full seconds, neither of them moved. Then Calder, beside him, said something close to his ear, and Darius returned his attention to the circle, smooth and unhurried, as though the moment had not happened at all. Mabel realized she had been holding her breath. "He looked at you," Petra said, very quietly, with an expression Mabel couldn't quite read. "People look at people. It means nothing. Not him." Petra set her cup down. "In 4 years, I have served at every major gathering in this region. I have watched Darius Vane walk through rooms full of high-born women, pack daughters, Alpha's mates, nobles who spent weeks preparing to be noticed by him." She looked at Mabel steadily. "He doesn't look. Not like that." Mabel opened her mouth to say something sensible and dismissive. Before she could, a commotion near the hall's main doors cut through the music and conversation, like a blade through cloth. 2 of the king's guard, she recognized the black and silver on their armor now, pushed through the entrance, snow still on their shoulders, their faces tight with contained urgency. They moved directly to Darius, and the message they delivered was short. She couldn't hear the words from across the hall, but she saw the effect. Every line in Darius's body shifted, not into panic, but into the focused, cold alertness of a man receiving information he had been afraid to receive. He said something to his brothers. Calder's easy expression vanished. Bram turned immediately toward the door. Then Darius looked across the hall one final time, and his eyes found Mabel again. And this time she had no explanation for why he did it, no logic she could offer herself or Petra or anyone, but the look lasted only a moment before he turned and walked out of the stone hall of Hartwell with his brothers at his back and his guards closing around him. The music continued. The feast continued. Most of the hall barely noticed. Mabel sat with the warm cider going cold in her hands and understood, with the quiet certainty of instinct rather than reason, that something had just shifted in the night. Something she couldn't name yet. Something that had nothing to do with Rawdon or the sand-colored dress or the copper earrings her mother had left her. She didn't know what it was. She only knew she felt it. And 2 hours later, walking home alone through the dark forest road, her cloak pulled tight against the winter cold, she found out exactly what it was when she stepped off the path to avoid a fallen branch and nearly tripped over the body of a man lying face down in the snow. One large hand pressed to his side, 2 infants wrapped in dark wool bound against his chest with leather straps. Both of them alive, both of them silent, both of them watching her with pale, impossible eyes. She dropped to her knees in the snow beside him. She turned him over, and she looked into the face of the man from the stone hall, the still one, the silent one, the one who had said someone who noticed. Except now his face was drawn with pain, his breathing shallow, and his dark braids were matted at the temple with blood. "Don't," he said, voice low and rough, his free hand rising slightly as if to stop her from doing something. "Don't call out." "You're injured," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Yes." His pale eyes held hers. "Can you walk?" "You can't walk." "I didn't ask about me." She stared at him. The two infants against his chest stirred, but didn't cry. The snow kept falling. Somewhere deep in the forest, she heard the sound that wolves made when they were hunting something. Low, deliberate, patient. "How far?" she asked. Something shifted in his expression. Not relief, exactly. Something quieter than that. Recognition, perhaps, of the kind of person who asks how far instead of why me. "Half a mile north. There's a keeper's lodge." He tried to move and failed, and the sound he made was the sound of a man who never makes sounds. "I need you to help me stand." Mabel tucked the warm cider cup into her cloak pocket. She didn't know why, habit perhaps, and put her shoulder under his arm. He was extraordinarily heavy. She stood anyway. The keeper's lodge was exactly half a mile north, just as he had said. Mabel knew this because she counted her steps the entire way, which was the only thing that kept her focused on the task of moving forward, rather than on the weight of the man leaning against her shoulder, the sound of wolves somewhere behind them in the dark, or the two infants strapped to his chest who had not made a single sound since she had found him in the snow, which was either a mercy or the most unsettling thing she had ever encountered, and she had not yet decided which. He walked. She would give him that. Another man in his condition would have asked to be dragged, or simply stopped moving. Darius Vane put one foot in front of the other, with the grinding, methodical determination of someone who has decided that falling is not an option, and he did not complain. And he did not slow down more than he had to, and the only sounds he made were the controlled exhales of someone managing pain through sheer discipline rather than its absence. She did not ask questions. There would be time for questions, or there wouldn't be, and either way the forest road was not the place for them. The lodge materialized out of the dark, and the snowfall as a low shape against the tree line, stone walls, a heavy wooden door, two shuttered windows with faint amber light leaking through the gaps. Someone had been here before them, or someone was waiting. Mabel didn't slow her pace to consider which possibility was more alarming. She pushed the door open with her free hand. Inside, a single room, a stone fireplace with a fire already burning low, a rough-hewn table, two chairs, a sleeping pallet in the corner covered with dark wool blankets, and a woman standing beside the fireplace, with her arms crossed, and an expression of profound, exhausted relief that cracked open the moment the door swung wide. "Darius." The woman stepped forward, then stopped, looking at Mabel with sudden uncertainty. "Who is—" "She helped me off the road," Darius said, which was the most efficient possible summary of the last 30 minutes, and left out approximately everything. "Close the door." The woman closed it. She was perhaps 40, dark-haired with silver threading through it, wearing a heavy traveling cloak over practical clothes. Her eyes were sharp, and her hands were quick, and the way she moved toward Darius, helping Mabel lower him into one of the chairs without being asked, suggested someone who had navigated emergencies before and found panic to be an inefficient response to them. "I'm Senna," the woman said to Mabel, already unwrapping the leather straps holding the infants to Darius's chest. "I've served the Vane household for 16 years. And you are?" "Mabel. I work in Beta Rodden's house. I was walking home from the gathering when I found him." Senna glanced at her briefly, then back to the infants she was carefully lifting free. "You found the Alpha King bleeding in the snow, and your first instinct was to help him stand rather than run." "Running seemed less useful," Mabel said. Senna made a sound that in another context might have been a laugh. She settled both infants onto the pallet with practiced efficiency, tucking the dark wool around them. They were small, very small, the particular smallness of the very young, with wisps of dark hair and their father's pale, serious eyes. They looked at the ceiling and at each other, and at Senna, and showed no distress whatsoever, which confirmed Mabel's earlier suspicion that they were either exceptionally calm or exceptionally unusual, and given whose children they were, she was beginning to suspect the latter. "How old are they?" Mabel asked, before she could stop herself. 4 months, Senna said. "The boy is Kale. The girl is Wren." Mabel looked at them for a moment. Kale and Wren, 4 months old, wrapped in dark wool in a keeper's lodge in the middle of a winter forest, while their father sat bleeding in a chair 3 feet away and wolves moved through the trees outside. They looked, she thought, remarkably unbothered. She turned back to Darius. He was sitting with his forearm braced on the table, head slightly bowed, the controlled quality of his stillness fraying at the edges now that the immediate task of moving was finished. The wound was on his left side, below the ribs. She could see it now, a dark stain spreading through the leather of his armor, the kind of deliberate, precise injury that did not come from an accident. "That was an arrow," she said. "Yes. Someone shot you. Also, yes. With your children on your chest." He looked up at her then. The pale eyes were clearer than she expected for someone in his condition. The pain present but controlled, pushed to the perimeter of his attention rather than its center. "They were the safest place for the children to be," he said simply. "No one who wanted to kill me would risk the heirs." Mabel absorbed this with the particular stillness of someone filing away a piece of information that raises far more questions than it answers. She took off her cloak, folded it over the back of the empty chair, and looked at Senna. "Do you have anything to clean the wound?" "In my pack." Senna was already moving. "Can you—" "Yes," Mabel said, before the question was finished. She had cleaned wounds before. Beta Rodden's household was not a gentle place, and years of service there had taught her things she had never asked to know. How to pack a cut without flinching, how to tell a wound that needs burning from one that only needs binding, how to keep her hand steady when everything else in the room was not. She pulled her chair close to Darius's, took the cloth and the small clay pot of drawing salve that Senna pressed into her hands, and got to work. He did not make a sound. She worked carefully, cleaning the wound and examining the depth of it, and the silence between them was not the silence of strangers. It was something else. The silence of two people concentrating on the same task from opposite sides, which has a peculiar intimacy to it that neither of them acknowledged. "You were at the gathering tonight," he said, after a while. "So were you." "I was there for an hour." A pause. "I saw you come in." Mabel kept her eyes on her work. "I came with the Grey Pack." "You came with Beta Rodden." His voice carried no judgment, only the flat accuracy of someone who observes carefully. "And then you left alone." "My plans for the evening changed." "So did mine." She glanced up at him briefly. The firelight moved across his face, the scar along the jaw, the dark braids, the eyes that were watching her with that same quality of attention she had felt across the hall. Except at this distance it was considerably more immediate. "Who shot you?" she asked. "Someone who followed me from the gathering." He exhaled slowly as she pressed the cloth against the wound. "Someone who knew I would be traveling with the children and without a full guard. Someone with access to information about my movements. An enemy within one of the packs. That is my current thinking." "And your brothers?" "Calder and Bram went back through the northern road. They don't know what happened yet." He paused. "Senna sent a signal from the lodge. They'll come when they can do so without being followed." Mabel nodded and returned to her work. The wound was deep but clean. The arrow had been removed, she noted, which meant he had pulled it out himself at some point during the half-mile between wherever he had been shot and wherever she had found him, which was either very brave or very foolish, or both simultaneously. "You pulled the arrow out yourself," she said. "It was inconvenient to leave it in. It bled more without it." "Yes. That was not a wise decision." "No." Something shifted in his expression, not quite amusement, but a relative of it. "It was a fast one." She finished binding the wound with clean linen from Senna's pack, tied it with the careful knot that Lady Helga had taught her a decade ago for reasons Lady Helga had never fully explained, and sat back in her chair. Her hands were steady. The sand-colored dress, she noticed distantly, had a dark stain along the hem now where she had knelt in the snow. She found she did not particularly mind. Across the room, Cale made a small sound, not distressed, simply present. And Wren turned her head toward her brother with the focused attention of someone tracking something important. Senna moved between them quietly, checking, settling. "They're remarkable," Mabel said, looking at the two infants. "They haven't cried once. They don't cry much." Darius followed her gaze. Something in his expression changed when he looked at his children. The controlled distance he wore like second armor fell slightly, and underneath it was something simpler and more unguarded. "They've been through a great deal for 4 months of life. Perhaps they've learned patience already, or perhaps they know their father won't let anything happen to them." The words came out before she had fully decided to say them. She heard them land in the room and felt the particular discomfort of having said something true and personal to someone she had known for less than 2 hours. Darius looked at her. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind had picked up, pushing snow against the shuttered windows in soft, rhythmic waves. "What happened to their mother?" she asked more quietly. The silence that followed was not evasive. It was careful. The silence of a man choosing how to carry something in front of someone new. "She died," he said. 3 weeks after they were born." A pause. "It was not an accident." Mabel held his gaze. She did not offer condolences in the hollow, reflexive way that people often did, because they didn't know what else to give. She simply looked at him and let what he had said occupy the space it deserved. "And now someone is trying to reach the children through you," she said. "Through me, or past me." His jaw tightened slightly. "There are those who believe that without a mate, without an alpha queen, the throne is unstable, that the children are vulnerable, that the right pressure applied in the right moment might—" He stopped. From outside, close enough now that it was no longer a sound Mabel could dismiss as the wind, came the low and deliberate call of wolves moving through the trees. Not Calder, not Bram, something else. Darius was on his feet before the sound finished, one hand on the table for a single steadying second, the wound pulling at him visibly. Senna already had both infants in her arms. The fire threw wild shadows across the stone walls. Mabel stood and looked at the door and made the same quiet calculation she had made in the snow. Running seemed less useful. "Tell me what you need," she said. And Darius Vane looked at her across the firelit room with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. Not surprise exactly, but the specific quality of a man who has spent years surrounded by people who needed things from him, encountering, perhaps for the first time, someone who was simply asking what she could do. "Stay close to the children," he said. She moved to Senna's side without another word. The wolves outside circled the lodge once before they moved. Mabel heard them through the stone walls, the soft compression of paw prints in snow, the particular silence that predators carry with them like a second skin, broken only by the occasional low sound that was less a call and more a coordination. There were at least 4. Possibly more. She had grown up near the edge of Greypack territory, and she knew the difference between wolves moving through the forest without purpose and wolves moving through it with one. These had one. Darius stood beside the door with the stillness she was beginning to recognize as his natural state under pressure. Not frozen, but gathered, the way a river gathers before a falls. He had taken a short blade from somewhere inside his armor, which he held loosely at his side, with the ease of someone for whom a blade is not a weapon of last resort, but simply a tool he happened to be holding. His breathing was controlled, and even despite the wound, despite the blood soaking slowly through the linen binding she had tied 20 minutes ago, Senna had both infants pressed against her chest, her back to the far wall, her eyes moving between the door and the two shuttered windows with rapid, intelligent calculation. Kale and Wren made no sound. They watched the room with their pale, serious eyes, as though they understood that silence was the correct response and had already decided to provide it. Mabel stood between Senna and the right window, holding the only thing that had presented itself as useful: the iron poker from beside the fireplace, which was not a sophisticated weapon, but was solid and heavy, and had the advantage of being immediately available. Darius glanced at it, then at her. He said nothing, but something in his expression registered and filed the information away. The circling stopped. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Mabel had ever heard. Then the door shook. Not a knock, not an attempt at entry, but a single deliberate impact, the kind meant to test the strength of the bolt rather than request permission. Darius moved a half-step closer to the center of the room, blade rising slightly. A second impact. The bolt held. Then from outside, 2 sharp whistles, a pause, and one long one. Darius exhaled. "Calder," he said. He crossed the room, drew the bolt, and opened the door. Calder Vane came through first, snow on his red hair and shoulders, green eyes sharp and scanning the room in one fast sweep before they landed on his brother, and darkened with something that moved quickly through relief and arrived at anger. Behind him came Bram, broader and darker, with 3 of the King's Guard pressing in after, black and silver armor catching the firelight. "You pulled the arrow out yourself," Calder said immediately, looking at the blood-soaked binding. "So I've been told," Darius replied. "By whom?" Calder's eyes found Mabel, still holding the fireplace poker, standing beside Senna with an expression of measured calm that had apparently decided it was going to hold until it was given a specific reason not to. His expression shifted into something between confusion and the reluctant beginning of admiration. "Who are you?" "Mabel. I found him on the road." "She kept him moving, cleaned the wound, and bound it," Senna said from the corner, with the brisk tone of a woman providing an accurate report. Calder looked at his brother. "You were found by a maid from the Grey Pack." "Yes." "Bleeding in the snow." "Also yes." "With the children strapped to your chest." Calder. "I'm constructing a full picture, Darius." "The picture is complete." Darius moved back to the chair and sat down, which was not a concession to weakness but to efficiency, the decision of a man who recognized that standing was currently costing him more than it was worth. "Bram, what did you find on the North Road?" Bram had not spoken since entering. He spoke now, in the flat, precise way of someone who delivers information without decoration. 2 men. Grey Pack markings on the arrows. Both gone before we reached them, but we found the position. A rise above the fork in the road. Perfect line to the path you would have taken. Someone told them your route. The room went quiet. Grey Pack markings. Mabel felt the implication land in the room, and watched it reach every person present in a different way. Calder's jaw tightening, Bram's eyes moving briefly to her, Senna going very still. She did not look away from any of it. She had nothing to hide, but she understood what Grey Pack markings meant in this context. And she understood that understanding it was something she needed to demonstrate clearly. "Beta Rodden was at the gathering tonight," she said. Her voice was even. "He had a conversation with the Vorn patriarch near the head table. I don't know what was said, but it was private and it was long." "You observed this," Darius said. I had a great deal of time to observe things this evening. She paused. Rawdon knows I walked home on the North Forest Road. He knows I leave that way after every gathering. If someone needed to know which road you would use, they might have used someone who already knew the road, Calder finished. He was looking at her differently now. Not with suspicion. The suspicion had been brief, and he had moved through it quickly. But with the focused attention of someone reassessing a situation. Or someone who didn't know they were providing the information. I didn't speak to Rawdon after he... She stopped, amended. I didn't speak to Rawdon after our conversation near the fireplace. I left the hall within 20 minutes of arriving. We know, Darius said quietly. She looked at him. I saw you leave, he said. Simply. Without explanation of what that meant or why he had been watching closely enough to notice. The fire popped. Outside, the wind had settled, and the forest had returned to its ordinary winter silence. The kind that held nothing dangerous. Only cold and trees, and the distant sound of the river running under ice somewhere to the east. Bram crouched beside the sleeping pallet and looked at Cale and Wren with an expression that, on a man as generally granite-faced as Bram Vane, constituted significant softness. Cale grabbed his finger with both hands immediately, with the decisive grip of someone staking a claim. Bram looked at this development with complete solemnity and did not attempt to retrieve his finger. The lodge is secure for the night, Bram said, without looking up. We move at first light. Move where? Mabel asked. North, Darius said. To the High Keep. It's the only place I can be certain of the walls. And me. She asked it without particular emotion, only the practical need to understand what her situation was. I can walk back to Hartville at first light. It's 2 hours. I know the road. Alone, Calder said. On a road that was used tonight by men with gray pack arrows, who may or may not know that a maid from Beta Rawdon's household spent the night in this lodge with the Alpha King. Mabel opened her mouth, closed it. The logic was irritating because it was correct. She comes with us, Darius said. He was looking at the fire, not at her. Until we understand the full shape of what happened tonight, she stays where we can account for her safety. I'm not your responsibility, Mabel said. No. He looked at her then. You're a woman who helped me stand up off the ground when you had no reason to, and kept your head in a situation that would have unraveled most people. A pause. That makes you someone I choose to be responsible for. There's a difference. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable exactly. It was the silence of something being said that was larger than the words used to say it, settling into the room like heat from the fire. Slow, pervasive, impossible to ignore once you noticed it. Calder cleared his throat. Bram pretended to be entirely focused on Cale's grip on his finger. I'll need something warmer than this dress, Mabel said finally. Senna has a spare cloak, Darius said, and the matter was settled. They slept in shifts. The guards kept watch outside. Mabel sat near the fire for her portion of the night, Wren drowsing in the crook of her arm, because Senna had handed her over with the confidence of someone who had correctly assessed that Mabel's lap was going to be steadier than her own for the next few hours. The infant was lighter than she expected, and warmer. A compact, serious presence who looked up at Mabel's face with the focused attention of someone conducting a thorough evaluation. I don't know what you're looking for, Mabel told her quietly. But I should tell you I'm just a maid. Wren appeared unimpressed by this information. She continued her evaluation. Your father, Mabel continued very quietly, watching the fire, walked 1/2 mile through snow with an arrow wound in you on his chest, and he didn't put you down once. She paused. You should know that, when you're old enough to understand it. From across the room, in the chair he had refused to vacate for the pallet because the pallet was where Senna had put the children, Darius said, without opening his eyes. She'll remember it anyway. Wolves always know. Mabel looked over at him. His eyes were still closed, his breathing slower now. Not asleep, but resting. The careful conservation of a man who knew he would need what he was saving. "How do you know I wasn't talking to myself?" she asked. "Because you're not the kind of person who talks to themselves." A pause. "You're the kind who talks to whoever needs to hear it." She had no answer for that. She turned back to the fire, and Wren settled against her arm with a small sound of approval, and the night continued around them. Quiet, cold, the snow still falling outside, the guards at their posts, Cale asleep with Bram's retrieved finger still loosely circled in his small fist across the room. Just before she slept, Mabel thought about the sand-colored dress and the copper earrings, and the 2 hours she had spent in that chest preparing for a night that had turned out to be nothing like what she planned. She thought about Rawdon, and the woman in the silver dress, and the way he had said things have changed as though she were a minor inconvenience being efficiently resolved. She thought about the strange arithmetic of nights, how a person could walk into one evening expecting very little of themselves, and walk out of it having been something they hadn't known they were capable of. She fell asleep with the Alpha King's daughter in her arms, and the fire burning low and the forest quiet outside, and she did not dream of anything sad. They left the lodge at first light. The snow had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the forest clean and still, every branch edged in white. The sky above the tree line the particular pale gray that comes just before the sun commits to rising. Mabel wore Senna's spare cloak, dark wool, heavier than her own, smelling of pine resin and the particular dry warmth of a traveling pack kept near a fire. It was slightly too long for her, and she didn't mind. She pulled the hood up and walked. Darius walked beside her. He should not have been walking at all, which was a point Calder had made 3 separate times before abandoning it with the resigned efficiency of a man who has spent his entire life making reasonable arguments to someone constitutionally uninterested in being reasonable. Darius walked with the same grinding, methodical determination she had witnessed the night before, only marginally slower, and he did not complain. And the only concession he made to the wound was that Senna carried Cale, and one of the guards carried Wren, which meant his arms were free and his side was not bearing additional weight. Mabel had checked the binding before they left. It had held through the night. The wound was not festering. She had been afraid of that, in the cold. But the drawing salve had done its work, and the flesh around the linen was clean and tight. She had retied the knot without being asked, and he had let her, and neither of them had said anything about it. They walked north. The high keep revealed itself gradually, first as a shadow above the tree line, then as towers, then as walls of dark stone rising from a ridge above the forest, banners of black and silver moving in the cold morning wind. It was larger than she had imagined. Older. The kind of structure that had been built not to impress, but to last. Every stone placed with the understanding that it would need to hold for centuries. It held. The gates opened before they reached them. Word had gone ahead. Riders sent by Bram at first light, and the household was awake and waiting. A controlled and quiet readiness rather than chaos, which told her something about the kind of place Darius Vane ran. A healer met them in the first courtyard, a compact woman with gray-streaked hair who looked at the binding on Darius's side with professional criticism, and at Mabel with brief, surprised approval. "Clean work," the healer said, unwrapping the linen with careful hands. "Who did this?" "She did," Darius said, without inflection. The healer looked at Mabel again. Longer this time. "You have training?" "Practical experience," Mabel said. "Same thing sometimes." The healer returned to her work. "He'll need 3 days of rest and a week of limited movement." She said this to Darius directly, which suggested she had learned there was no point in saying it to anyone else first. 2 days, Darius said. 3. 2.5. 3, the healer repeated, with the absolute serenity of someone who has had this exact negotiation before and always wins it. She wrapped the wound in fresh linen, tied it with a knot considerably more elaborate than Mabel's, and stood. The children should be kept warm and checked before midday. She looked at Senna, then at Mabel, with a brief assessment that seemed to include both of them in the same category of capable. Either of you can do it. You both know what you're looking for. Mabel almost said, "I'm just a maid." She caught the words before they left her mouth, which was something she had been doing with increasing frequency since the previous evening, and she wasn't sure yet what to make of that. The next 3 days had a shape she hadn't anticipated. She had expected to be given a room and politely contained in it, while the Vane household managed its crisis and decided what to do with the maid from the Grey Pack, who had become inconveniently entangled in the Alpha King's affairs. Instead, she was given a room. Small, clean, with a narrow window overlooking the inner courtyard, and then almost immediately drawn out of it by the simple gravitational logic of being useful. Senna needed help with the twins. The twins were 4 months old and in perfect health, and absolutely certain that the world existed for their benefit and intended to conduct themselves accordingly. Kale had opinions about feeding schedules. Wren had developed a strong preference for being carried facing outward so she could observe everything, which meant that whoever was holding her needed a free hand for anything else, which was a logistical challenge that Mabel solved by improvising a carrier from a length of linen that Senna looked at with impressed surprise and immediately replicated. "Where did you learn that?" Senna asked. "Lady Helga's sister had 5 children and no help," Mabel said. "You learn things." She learned things about the High Keep, too, in those 3 days. The way you learn the layout of a place by moving through it with purpose. The great hall with its high stone ceiling, and the long table where the pack leaders had sent urgent messages that arrived in a steady stream throughout the first day. The library 2 floors up, where Bram spent most of his waking hours bent over documents and maps with the focused intensity of a man building a case. The smaller room off the eastern corridor where Calder could usually be found either eating something or sharpening something or complaining entertainingly about the weather. On the second morning, Calder found her in the corridor outside the nursery with Wren in the linen carrier and a bowl of porridge in her free hand. Breakfast, claimed before it got cold, which was becoming a necessary skill. And he fell into step beside her with the easy familiarity of someone who has decided, without making a formal announcement, that you are now part of the household. "You know what's happening with Rawdon," he said, not a question. "I know what I've heard in passing," she said, "which is probably less than you intend to tell me." Bram found the correspondence. Calder's voice was light, but his eyes were not. Rawdon had been feeding information about Darius's movements to a faction within the Vorn family for 6 months. The arrangement predated the gathering. The archer on the road was hired through a contact in the Eastern Territory. He paused. The Vorn patriarch didn't know. It was his second son, acting independently. He thought if Darius died without a clear succession, the Northern throne would fracture and the Vorn pack could claim the Eastern Territories in the chaos. Mabel was quiet for a moment, watching Wren study the ceiling with her customary intense focus. "And Rawdon is no longer beta of the Grey Pack," Calder said. "As of this morning. Darius sent the declaration at dawn. The Grey Pack Council confirmed it within the hour." He glanced at her sideways. "He won't trouble you again." She hadn't asked about that. She noticed that Calder had said it anyway, and she noticed what that meant. That someone had thought about whether she needed to hear it, and had made sure she did. And she filed that away with the rest of the things from these 3 days that she wasn't ready to fully examine yet. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Calder said, with a smile that was almost but not quite as casual as he intended it to be. "Thank the man who made the declaration in 6 sentences when he usually takes 6 paragraphs." On the 3rd evening, Darius came to find her. She was in the small courtyard off the eastern wing, the one with the stone bench and the bare winter rose bushes and the view of the ridge where the forest began. She had come there because the twins were sleeping. Senna was resting, and she had realized, sitting in the sudden quiet of the nursery, that she had not been alone and still since the night she had found him in the snow, and that she needed a moment to understand what she was going to do next. She heard him before she saw him. Not his footsteps, which were nearly silent, but the slight change in the quality of the air that she had started to notice, that particular gathered stillness that preceded him like a tide. He sat down on the other end of the stone bench. He moved carefully, the wound making itself known in the slight adjustment of how he settled his weight. But he sat straight. He always sat straight. The healer said 3 days, Mabel said, without turning her head. It has been 3 days. She meant resting. I have been resting. A pause. Relatively. She looked at him then. He was watching the ridge, the last light of the evening catching the pale gray of his eyes, the dark braids loose around his shoulders for the first time since she had met him. Without the full armor, in a simpler dark tunic, with the buckled straps removed, he looked like the same man but with fewer layers between him and the world. Not smaller, just closer. I should go back, she said. To Hartville. I have work, and Rawdon's household will be restructured, Darius said. The position you held no longer exists in its current form. I know, Calder told me. Then you know you're not going back to what you left. She had known that, actually. She had known it since the morning she woke up in the small, clean room with the narrow window and realized that Hartville felt, not like home calling her back, but like a door she had already walked through and left behind her. I don't know what I'm going back to, she said honestly. You could stay. She looked at him. He was still watching the ridge, but the quality of his stillness had shifted. Less closed, more open. The difference between a man presenting a fact and a man offering something he actually cares about the answer to. The children need someone consistent, he said. Senna is extraordinary, but she can't do everything. The keep needs people who understand how to remain calm when things are not calm. He paused. I need people around me who I can trust, and I have learned in the last 3 days that trust is not something I extend easily or often. But when I do, I don't revoke it without cause. That's not a reason for me to stay, she said. That's a list of your requirements. Yes. He turned to look at her then, directly, the way he had looked at her across the stone hall of Hartville, and across the firelit lodge, and every moment in between. The reason for you to stay is that you belong here more than you ever belonged in that house, and I think you know that. And I am asking you, not requiring, asking. The courtyard was very quiet. Somewhere above them in the nursery window a light was burning. Senna, or a guard, moving through the last of the evening tasks. The bare rose bushes cast thin shadows across the stone, and the ridge was going dark, and the first stars were appearing above the tree line, and Mabel sat with all of it and let herself, for the first time in a very long time, simply feel what was true, rather than what was practical. What was true was this. She had walked into a feast expecting to be claimed by a man who saw her as a convenience, and instead, she had walked out of a forest lodge having held an alpha king upright through the snow, cleaned his wound by firelight, slept with his daughter in her arms, and discovered, somewhere in the space between those things, that she was considerably more capable than 3 years in Beta Rawdon's house had allowed her to be. What was also true was that the man sitting 3 feet away from her on a cold stone bench had looked at her, really looked, not past her, not through her, not at the version of her that was useful, from the very first moment, and had not stopped. I'll need better quarters than the room off the eastern corridor, she said. The window faces the wrong direction. I can't see the forest. Something moved across Darius's face. Something warm and unguarded and completely unperformed. The expression of a man who has not smiled easily in a long time and has just been given a reason to. That can be arranged, he said. What happened after was not a single moment, but a gradual, unambiguous settling, the kind of change that doesn't announce itself but simply becomes, over time, impossible to imagine having been otherwise. Mabel stayed. She took the room with the forest-facing window, which turned out to overlook the eastern ridge and the first line of pines and, on clear mornings, the distant shape of the mountains beyond. She worked with Senna and learned the rhythms of the keep, and she was good at it. Not just adequate, but genuinely, naturally good at it, in the way that suggested she had always been capable of exactly this, and had simply been placed, until now, in rooms too small to show it. Kale and Wren grew. Kale became opinionated and loud and deeply attached to Bram, who received this attachment with unbroken solemnity, and was, by any objective measure, completely devoted to the child while maintaining a convincing performance of indifference. Wren became watchful and precise, and learned to communicate her preferences through a system of expressions so exact that Mabel could read them across a room, which delighted her and slightly unnerved everyone else. Calder declared, on no particular occasion, that Mabel was the best thing to happen to the Northern Keep in years, and said it loudly enough that the declaration echoed off the great hall ceiling, and then walked away before anyone could respond, which was entirely characteristic. Bram said nothing, which, from Bram, meant the same thing. Darius said it differently. He said it in the way he moved through the same space as her, with a consciousness of where she was that was not possessive, but was simply present, constant. The natural orientation of someone who has identified the fixed point in a room and adjusted accordingly. He said it in the way he listened when she spoke, fully, without the half-attention of a man waiting for his turn. He said it in the way he came to find her in the evenings, in the courtyard, or the library, or wherever she had settled, and sat near her with the particular quality of someone who has been many places and has found, finally, the one where the restlessness stops. He said it, eventually, in words, quietly, directly, without performance, the same way he said every true thing. And she answered him the same way, and neither of them made it complicated, because neither of them had the patience for that kind of distance anymore. They were bound before the pack in the great hall of the High Keep on the last day of winter, the 5-pack banners overhead and the fire burning high in the central hearth, and Kale balanced on Bram's arm, making his opinions about the ceremony known in a series of determined sounds that Wren ignored, with aristocratic composure, from her position in Senna's arms. Calder stood beside his brother with the expression of a man who is very pleased with how things turned out, and is trying, with limited success, to appear as though he had nothing to do with it. Rawdon was not there. He had been removed from the Grey Pack Beta position and relocated to the Outer Territories, a quiet and permanent consequence delivered without spectacle, which was exactly the kind of resolution that Darius preferred. The Vorn's second son faced a formal reckoning before the Pack Council, a long process, measured and thorough, that Bram oversaw with the meticulous satisfaction of someone who has been building a case for weeks and is finally allowed to present it. The Grey Pack, reorganized under new leadership, sent their banner to hang in the Great Hall as a renewed gesture of fealty. It hung beside the black banner with the silver wolf, which was where it would remain. Mabel stood in the Great Hall in a dress that was not sand-colored linen with simple embroidery. It was dark green, deep, and rich, with silver stitching at the cuffs and collar. Senna had made it, over the quiet weeks of winter, without being asked, because Senna had learned, long before Mabel had entirely accepted it herself, that the woman standing beside the Alpha King was not temporary. She wore the copper earrings her mother had left her. She had decided, some time ago, that they were exactly right for every occasion. Darius stood beside her and said the words of the binding in front of the pack, and his brothers, and the healer, and Senna, and Kale, and Wren, and the assembled households of the 5 northern territories. And his voice was low and even and entirely certain, the voice of a man who has not arrived at this moment by accident, but by a sequence of deliberate choices, beginning with the decision to look across a crowded hall at a woman walking toward a door and say simply, "Leaving already?" She had not left. She never did. The winter ended. Spring came to the high keep the way it always did. Slowly, then all at once. The snow retreating from the ridge and the rose bushes in the eastern courtyard, putting out their first cautious green. Mabel sat on the stone bench one morning with Wren in her lap, and Cale attempting to pull himself upright against the bench leg, with the focused determination of someone who has decided that standing is the next necessary project. And Darius sat beside her reading a dispatch from the Eastern Territories, and the sun was coming over the ridge in long gold lines across the stone. And somewhere inside the keep, she could hear Calder arguing cheerfully with someone about something that probably didn't matter. It was ordinary. Entirely, completely ordinary. She had spent 23 years waiting for ordinary to feel like enough. It felt, she thought, watching the sun move across the courtyard and Cale make his fourth determined attempt at verticality, like considerably more than that. It felt like everything. And it was.